Hey friends, Jim here with Science Talk. Okay, some more news from uh, COP27. 40 countries to reveal methane action plans. With 40 countries expected to unveil their methane reduction plans at COP27, global action on the climate busting greenhouse gas could get a boost after stalling out under industry pressure over the last year, even after more than 100 countries signed on to the global methane pledge at COP26. Delivering the details on how countries plan to tackle methane emissions is a crucial step for dealing with global warming, said Jonathan Banks, Global Director of Methane at the U.S. Clean Air Task Force, which tracks national pledges. We need to move out of the promises and more towards the action pieces, whether it's sectoral actions or larger actions, he said. The Global Methane Pledge was first announced by the United States and the European Union in September 2021, 2 months before the COP26 summit in Glasgow. The US and the EU jointly promised to reduce their methane emissions 30% from 2020 levels by 2030, and at least 35 more countries signed on in the weeks that followed. More than 100 countries, representing around 70% of the global economy, had signed on in the early days of the 2021 summit, and that tally has now grown to 130, according to the Global Methane Pledge website. Methane is an exceptionally potent greenhouse gas with 84 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide over a 20-year span, though methane remains in the atmosphere for a shorter amount of time. But it still keeps getting put in there. And, let's not forget the methane that's coming out of the thawing permafrost or the Arctic shelf as the warming oceanic waters thaws out the permafrost on the shelf systems there, especially on the Eurasian side of the Arctic basin. And that releases more methane. So we could stop burning methane, but methane is still going to be emitted. Rice paddies emit methane. Now, will fracking continue? Probably. Fracking is, big user of methane. What about the various power plants and production facilities where they flare off the methane gas? Go to Prudhoe Bay as an example, and they use methane to inject it into the ground to force the crude up, which then goes into the pipeline, blah, blah, blah. But methane's being flared off up there all the time. You see it all the time. And it's kind of crazy because there actually is it's an 8-inch pipeline, but there's an actual 8-inch pipeline that goes from Prudhoe down to Pump Station 4. And Pump Station 4 runs on that methane. Why they couldn't continue it, who the hell knows? That's a whole nother discussion. And also, Russia right now with many countries no longer buying their gas, well, they're forced to burn it off. They don't have the capability to store the gas they're creating. So they're burning off the gas. And we know what that means. You don't need me to explain, how terrible situation that is. So, and we just saw that some of the plans is to switch to gas and call it a transformative or transformational fuel. Really? So transformational, implying that we're getting off of fossil fuels and going to something else. And exactly how long is this transformational phase? Is it going to be a year, 5 years, a decade, 2 decades? What the hell? If it is, well, if we're going to be, say, 2 decades, well, we're screwed. We're already screwed, but we'll really be screwed. So now they're saying that if all countries participated in this pledge, The pledge would reduce average global warming by 0.2 C in the 2040s. So what's the increase? Bet you the increase is more than 0.2. Now, the 40 countries expecting to reveal plans for putting the pledge into action indicate modest progress towards the target, said Reuters. According to a U.S. official, the plans will outline national regulations, standards, and investments in methane reduction and describe how those strategies fit into their broader climate targets. The US, Canada, and Vietnam are expected to be among the countries announcing plans, as are 15 other countries that have already published their strategies. Some other large methane emitters, like Brazil, are not likely to have plans drafted in time. And the world's two biggest emitters, China and India, have not ratified the pledge. I'm presuming emitters of methane, not total greenhouse gases, because that would be China and the US. Industry lobbying is slowing down action on methane. I've discussed that with you before. A think tank that provides data on Influence Map, a think tank that provides data on how business and finance are affecting the climate crisis. In both the US and the EU, the majority corporate engagement on methane regulation has been unsupportive or outright oppositional. With the fossil fuel and agricultural industries, the largest sources of methane generated by human activity, playing a major role in the pushback. Okay, agricultural industries. Livestock, bovine flatulence, rice paddies, just the overall livestock industry worldwide, whether you're growing or raising, be a better term, whether you're raising cattle, pork, pigs, they're large emitters of methane. Influence Mapped analysis shows several European oil and gas industry players successfully lobbying against including imported fossil fuels in the EU's methane regulation for the energy sector. Well, kind of defeats the whole purpose, doesn't it? Oh, we don't include imported fossil fuels. We're doing something. No, you're not. In the U.S., the push against the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, methane regulation has been dominated by associations like the American Petroleum Institute, the API, the American Gas Association, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which challenges the EPA's legal authority to regulate methane emissions. And let me add to that, it does not help when the Supreme Court basically neutered the EPA's legal authority in an extremely terrible decision by the court, actually in a string of recent terrible decisions by the Supreme Court. These industry efforts have helped maintain a wide gap between voluntary pledges and effective policy to cut methane. Given the strong industry pushback against methane regulations in Europe and the US, it is not particularly surprising that other jurisdictions have so far been slow to follow suit with their own policy proposals, said Vivek Parekh, a senior analyst at Influence Map. Yeah, basically, they're looking at the Europe and the U.S., maybe even China. You're supposed to be the leaders. You're the big boys. And if you're doing diddly squat, why should we do anything more? We're just following your example. And fear of farmer protests, like those that started in the Netherlands this past summer, has made politicians wary of enforcing methane regulations on agriculture producers, says Climate Home News. Meanwhile, new research in climate monitoring technology continue to expose the full extent of global methane emissions. Scientists found ancient vegetation is being newly exposed from melting glacial ice and may be releasing methane at an accelerating rate. You think? And industry processes have been identified as the source of more emissions than were previously tallied. Oh, we underestimated. Emissions are higher. Warming is higher. Geez. Who could have seen that coming? Just 30 fossil fuel companies account for nearly half of the planet-warming methane emitted by the energy sector, according to a new analysis by Global Energy Monitor. The top three are the National Iranian Oil Company, Russia's Gazprom, PJSC, and China Energy Investment Corporation, the world's top three highest methane emitters. Satellite monitoring has also been a critical tool for identifying methane leaks. NASA's Earth's Surface Mineral Dust Source Investigation, EMIT, recently located more than 50 methane super emitters, some of which have previously gone unseen, including oil and gas sites in Turkmenistan and New Mexico, and a waste processing facility in Iran. And also, when you cap off a wellhead, they still leak. They still leak. Could be methane, could be CO2. They still leak. So basically, methane emissions there's a lot more of it from some sources that were not previously considered, adding to their levels to the atmosphere, affecting the CO2 equivalent levels, adding to the warming. And then you have these, as we just discussed here, you have gas lobbying groups persuading politicians, translation, bribing them, to not really go ahead with these strong regulations or these strong target goals, reductions, and so forth. In other words, business as usual, like this here, right? Like what we see here. And we are rapidly, well, some will say we're rapidly running out of time. We have to do something by the end of this century. For those of you who follow me on a regular basis, you know my thoughts on that. In my view, the planet went past the tipping point overall in the mid-1990s. And 5C at minimum, more likely up to 7 or 9, even 11C is possible by 2100. But at the very least, 5C is locked in. And that's a very conservative locking in. And it's moot because an increase of 4C, as many ecologists point out, is sufficient to cause human extinction. So, human society, human civilization, human species, well, kind of screwed.